I don't believe there's anything more important in the lives of the membership of the church, in fact, in anyone's life, than to know where they came from, who they are. And I think that's particularly true for members of the church, because those early pioneers who established the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are absolutely remarkable. We become strong in our own lives by studying and understanding and appreciating the lives of those who went before us and made all of these things possible for us.
Mary Fielding was born July 21st, 1801 in Bedfordshire, England, the sixth child and the second daughter of John and Rachel Fielding. They were hardworking tenant farmers of Methodist persuasion.
John and Rachel Fielding were very strict Methodists. John was a preacher, and Rachel was also very strongly converted at the age of 16. And when they lived in Holiday, England, she would walk her children 4 miles both ways to church every Sunday. She was very specific about the way they wanted to be raised as religious Methodists. The Fieldings considered education for both their sons and daughters very important. As a result, their sons and daughters received the best education, which was not common at the time. Both Mary and Mercy used their education later in life. Mary was a school teacher and a governess, and that helped her provide an income later in life.
This is kind of on the edge of the Industrial Revolution, but Mary and her family are part of what some historians have called the Industrious Revolution. They're farmers. Her father is a tenant farmer.
The Fielding children grew up well educated and with an understanding of hard work and sacrifice. For Joseph, Mary, and Mercy, it would suit them well as Latter-day Saint pioneers. In March 1832, Joseph Fielding immigrated to what would be Toronto, Canada, to pursue the occupation of a tenant farmer. Mercy went with him, and Mary joined them in 1834.
When Mary arrives, they are meeting with a Methodist group there, led by one by the name of John Taylor. And John and Lenora Taylor have meetings in homes discussing, but still looking for truth besides the Methodist persuasion. That's why they've come to this land of promise.
Parley P. Pratt came to visit the group, and the Fielding sisters were a little concerned. They didn't really want to have anything to do with this mysterious Mormon religion.
According to Elder Pratt's account, he and John Taylor went into the countryside to preach the gospel to the locals. They came to the farm of Joseph Fielding. The two sisters, Mary and Mercy, saw him coming and fled into the countryside so as not to be seen associating with the Mormons and their new scripture. As it turned out, Joseph Fielding stayed and listened to Elder Pratt. He promised them that he would preach only the gospel from the scriptures. Mary and Mercy were invited to come back. An evening supper was prepared, and they all went to meeting. What happened next? Elder Pratt said, "We baptized Joseph Fielding and his two amiable and intelligent sisters, for such they proved to be in an eminent degree."
The Fieldings and the Taylors will give heed to the call to gather, and the saints are gathering in the Kirtland area. So the year now is 1837. Mary has recently arrived into Kirtland. The two sisters, Mercy and Mary, walking the streets of Kirtland,
two prim and proper, educated, wonderful sisters with the king's language and an accent.
One writer described the two sisters this way: Mary was beautiful to look upon. When she and her equally handsome sister, Mercy, came to Kirtland in 1837, trim, straight, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with delicately blooming cheeks and finely molded, graceful figures, clad in dainty silks of modern grace, they were the observed of all observers. Their refined and stately ways made them a shining mark in Kirtland society. Wherever they went, they were spoken of as those lovely English girls.
Joseph was called on a mission to England and later became president of the British mission. He was there for 4 years with the hopes that he would be able to encourage his family to join the church. None of them ever did, unfortunately. But serving in his mission was Heber C. Kimball. And Mary and Heber's wife, Valete, in Kirtland became very good friends. Mercy was 34, and she quickly became acquainted with Robert Thompson. Robert Thompson had also been serving a mission in the Upper Canada, and they were married and pretty quickly called on a mission to go back to Canada. She accompanied her husband.
It was June 1837 at Fairport Harbor, Ohio. Mary Fielding stood on the pier and bade farewell to her brother, Joseph, who was going to England as a missionary with Elder Kimball, and bade farewell to her sister Mercy, who was going to Canada with her husband, Robert Thompson. With her beloved siblings serving as missionaries, Mary was now all alone in Kirtland, a stranger in a strange land.
Mary Fielding is working as a governess or a tutor and helping with schooling in some of the families. She needs work. And she'll help with the Smith's home, Joseph Smith. And in the Hiram Smith home, she becomes familiar with him.
She writes a letter to her sister Mercy in the fall of 1837. And she's worried. She has been a governess. She has her education. She can take care of herself, but she's not sure where her next position is going to come. And as she's writing this letter, she says, "I will be at liberty tomorrow. I have been with this family. I have been acting as a governess for this family, but tomorrow I will be at liberty. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I trust that God will take care of me." She mentions this mutual friend of theirs who had just married a widower with 5 children. And she writes, "A situation I desire as little as I ever did." Now, she does not recognize that in a few months, she is actually going to be in the exact same position.
It was October 2nd, 1837, when Jerusha Barden Smith, Hiram's wife, was delivered of a baby girl. She did not recover from the labor and delivery, and on October 13th, she gathered her children about her and bade them farewell.
Hiram needs to come home abruptly before his business is finished down in Missouri. As a result, when he comes into town to be with his family, who is there but helping is Mary Fielding. She's expressed her concern and love for this family who has been found destitute for this time. She knows of the death. She's aware of it. Hiram goes into mourning for his wife. And Joseph, who follows shortly after the arrival into Kirtland, witnesses his elder brother in this mourning and petitions the Lord and asks, how should we act? He will now come to Hiram and say, Hiram, I know it's a short time, But there are children without a mother. And there is Mary, a wonderful, educated, delightful lady. I suggest you take her to wife. That must have been an interesting moment for Mary. I'm sure her plans didn't include at this time being stepmother now of 5 children, including an infant, and being married into the Smith family, the first family of the church, and in following in the footsteps of a wonderful mother, beloved mother by her children. And that's the situation she steps into. This will change her life forever.
Her own mother was a stepmother. She raised the daughter of her husband's first marriage. And Rachel, her mother, told Mary, never marry a widower. You never want to have stepchildren. It's just too hard.
She's married on Christmas Eve, December 24th of 1837. Joseph marries the two of them. She felt a sense of duty to help and to be there in this important place, to step into the reins of a family. She felt that. And she'll be very tender and kind in doing so, and very respectful of Joshua and all that she had created with her family, but she must move forward.
She immediately takes over. Well, we all know people who've adopted children, who've been foster parents, who become step parents. We know their struggles, we know their triumphs. There's a really interesting letter that Mary Fielding writes to Hiram, and this is how she closes it. Your faithful companion and friend, but unhappy stepmother, M. Smith. Now, in that unedited, raw letter, tells us something, that like all of us, she was struggling how to become a mother to children that were not her own.
To be in Kirtland at the very time when Hiram would need her. I mean, think about it. That's why history is such a great thing to study, because I use the term tapestry. I think a lot of lives are just kind of weaved with a divine plan. And in the case of Mary Fielding Smith, I think the hand of the Lord led her from England to Canada, to Kirtland, to the arms of Hiram after the death of his precious wife, Jerusha, at a time when he desperately needed someone to help raise his family.
Mary Fielding was British. She was born and raised in England. She immigrated to British North America, Canada, not the United States. So she comes into America as a brand new immigrant. She doesn't speak the same language. She has an English accent. She thinks differently. She has a different worldview. She's British. And all of a sudden to put her into this American family, the Smith family, which are fiercely loyal. She was struggling in that transition.
The joy that accompanied Hiram and Mary's marriage was surrounded by apostasy and dissent in Kirtland. The saints' time there was drawing to a close. In March 1838, Hiram and Mary made a long and difficult journey to far west Missouri, arriving May 27, 1838. That journey across the vast prairie frontier was to be a type of things to come for Mary.
So it took them 3 months to get from Kirtland to far west. They had a lot of difficulty during the trip, but Hiram had secured a home for them to live in, and he honestly hoped that this would be a long time place of residence for them, and was surprised at how quickly the opposition to the Mormons escalated.
Through the summer and fall of 1838, opposition to the church and persecution grew to a murderous pitch. From their home in far west, Hiram and Mary watched as the prophet Joseph Smith and others were arrested by the militia and taken away. Hiram worried and paced the floor all that night, wondering if his beloved brother yet lived. The next morning, right around noon, the militia, led by traitors, came to Hiram's door. He was called out, and he too was arrested. The following day, Hiram was granted 2 minutes with his family, but not allowed to say a word. He was marched away at the point of a bayonet. His family would not see him again for nearly 6 months.
Mary is pregnant at the time. She's having health difficulties. Hiram is now in jail. He's placed in Liberty Jail there at the beginning of December. While he's away going from Independence to Richmond to Liberty, Mary delivers a baby. And she names the baby after her brother, who she loves dearly. His name is Joseph Fielding. And so the baby is Joseph Fielding Smith. We know him as Joseph F. Smith, future president of the church. But Hiram is not there to see the birth, and Mary is very sick.
She is near death. She is in bad shape. And for months, perhaps about 5 months, she can't really take care of herself. And Mercy helps with everything. Mary is completely reliant on Mercy with Hiram away. And Mary, in the shape that she's in, is not able to write a lot to Hiram. There are problems in communicating and sending letters back and forth. Sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't.
The story is told by Joseph F. himself during his presidency, that during that time when the mob came in, I was laying on the bed, and they threw bedding on top of me. And by the time the mob had left, and they realized that Joseph F., the infant who had just been born, was unaccounted for, and by the time they found him under the bedding where the mob had thrown the covers on, he was practically lifeless. And so nearly, if it would have been much longer, we would have lost Joseph F. Smith.
In December of 1839, all of the wives of those 6 visit Liberty Jail, except one wife. And the one wife that isn't able to come is Mary. Mary's not able to visit Hiram. She's too sick. But you can imagine the sense of loss and frustration as Hiram is there incarcerated, unable to do anything for the family. And Mary is very sick for many months.
Notwithstanding her illness, Mary was determined to see Hiram in Liberty Jail. Understandably, he wanted to see his new son. Mercy recorded the following. About the 1st of February, 1839, by the request of her husband, my sister was placed on a bed in a wagon and taken a journey of about 40 miles to visit him in the prison. Her infant son, Joseph F., then being about 11 weeks old. I had to accompany her, taking my own babe along, then 8 months old. The weather was extremely cold. We suffered much on the journey. We arrived at the prison in the evening. We were admitted, and the doors were closed upon us. And as long as memory lasts will remain my recollection of the creaking hinges of that door which closed upon the noblest men on earth. Who can imagine our feelings as we traveled homeward? But would I sell the honor bestowed upon me of being locked up in jail with such characters of gold? No. No.
The day was pretty much over when they arrive at the jail just in time. They're going to shut the jail up and close it, so they were going to refuse them to go in, and Mary wants to show Hiram her firstborn son and give him a name. And so they persist that they might be able to go into the jail. And the jailer says, "You may stay the night." So Emma will stay the night in Liberty Jail, and so will Mary Fielding. I can't imagine what that must have been like for those two men to hold their wives close, and for Hiram and Mary Fielding to have little Joseph F. Smith in their arms through the night. That must have been a godsend for both Mary and for Hiram, and of course for Joseph and Emma. And Mary and Emma, at the encouraging of Hiram and Joseph, will now make their way with the saints across into Quincy. And again, Mary doesn't have the capacity to even walk, and she's carried in the back of a wagon in a bed with Joseph F. by her side. So the Liberty Jail experience. There's another side to this whole story besides just the prisoners. It's the women who are suffering.
I think in our trials, we come to know God. We come to know the Lord. You know, if you never had a trial, if you never had an occasion where you had to get down on your knees and plead for guidance and direction and answer, I'm not sure that you ever really have the same opportunity to connect with heaven. We connect with heaven sometimes by some of the challenges we go through.
In a letter to her brother, Joseph Fielding, Mary bore her soul. She said, "I would not give up the prospect of the latter-day glory for all that glitters in this world. My hope is full, and it is a glorious hope. We have been able to rejoice in the midst of our privations and persecutions that we were counted worthy to suffer these things, so that we may, with the ancient saints who suffered in like manner, inherit the same glorious reward. If it had not been for this hope, I should have sunk before this. But blessed be the God and rock of my salvation. Here I am, and imperfectly satisfied and happy, having not the smallest desire to go one step backward."
And so what's happening in June 1839 when she writes that affirmation of her testimony? She's just coming off being dreadfully sick to the point of death for months and months and months. Her husband has been in jail. Her husband has just barely returned to her. They're refugees from the state of Missouri. They've been driven from their home in Far West. They're preparing to begin again in commerce in Nauvoo. And yet in the midst of all that affliction, she's enthusiastic and excited about the gospel. That to me sums up Mary Fielding Smith. She's just an extraordinary woman.
The saints fled Missouri and took refuge in Quincy, Illinois. It was there that Mary and Hiram were reunited. By the summer of 1839, Hiram and Mary and the saints had taken refuge in and begun a new city in Commerce, Illinois.
This is the time when you really see Mary Fielding up front and become this lady of education and reason, and is taking the role on of this mother. And you have now the children, they're fully invested in their stepmother. And you see these letters, and you see these endearments, and you see she was as good as teacher as you would find in any of the schools in the area of Nauvoo. So she could school her children.
In Nauvoo, Hiram wasn't present very often. He had a lot of different roles. He was on the city council. He was the vice mayor. He became the second president of the church. He also became the patriarch of the church after his father died. Mary had these 5 children, or she had Joseph Fielding Smith, her 6th child, and then she had her daughter Martha, who was born in 1841. But she was also very involved in civic affairs, and she was very concerned about helping the homeless and the poor and the refugees. Hiram and Mary had their last child, Martha, who was born in 1841. And this is around the same time that Hiram and Jerusha's son, Hiram Jr., died at the age of 7, that Hiram's brother, Don Carlos, died, and that Mercy, Mary's sister, Mercy's husband, Robert Thompson, passed away. So it was a really hard time. There was a lot of mourning going on, and also a lot of family becoming closer as a result of that. Hiram loved his children. Joseph F. remembers how Hiram would sit him on his knee and tell him about the golden plates and tell him what they looked like and how they were used and translated into the Book of Mormon. And that experience was seared into Joseph F.'s head and helped him gain a testimony of the Book of Mormon.
Life in Nauvoo for Hiram and Mary became peaceful and prospering. Hiram acquired a beautiful farm east of town. Life was busy, but good. That same revelation that appointed Hiram as assistant president of the church also called for the building of a temple in Nauvoo.
At one point, Mercy, Mary's sister, was really concerned about what she could do to help contribute to the construction of the temple. And she prayed about it and received a revelation, an answer, that if she and Mary could start up a penny subscription fund for all the women, that they could gather enough money, the women would pay 1 penny every week. And then with that money, they would have enough to pay for the nails and the glass of the Nauvoo temple. So they talked to Hiram, who thought this was a great idea, and he spoke about it. He reported it in the Times and Seasons. Mary and Mercy wrote an article published in the Times and Seasons, and they sent an article to the Millennial Star. And soon they had British women participating. They had groups of women in Boston and in Lowell, Massachusetts, who were sending their money. This was a subscription, so it was a penny a week. And they saved all this money in a wooden box, a bank-type box. And when persecutions happened, and after the deaths of Hiram and Joseph Smith, they buried that box. They didn't want anyone to steal it, so they buried it in the backyard. A few years later, when they were continuing work on the Nauvoo temple, Brigham Young was really worried about losing the property. And he remembered that the ladies had saved this money. So he went to Mary and Mercy and asked if they had this money and if they would contribute it at this point. And they did. They had $2,000, and that money saved the Nauvoo temple.
Mary and Hiram are endowed in Nauvoo. They're sealed for time and eternity. And before the prophet's death, Mary Fielding is actually helping administer ordinances to other sisters in Nauvoo. So she has totally committed herself to the article of faith. We believe all God has revealed, that what he's now revealed, and that he will yet reveal. She has bought that belief completely and is open to it. And so I think that's one of the things that makes her very unique by the time Hiram dies. So I think what we now understand better than before is that this is not a monolithic faith that's static. It's a dynamic faith that's changing, and revelation is pushing boundaries. And Mary's heart, along with her brother and sister, are open to it. And so Nauvoo is a testament of that God is with his people and God is with his prophet. She's accepting all the doctrine being taught, all the new revelation, all the new ordinances.
As Joseph Smith continued revealing the Lord's mind and will to the saints in Nauvoo, opposition and persecution from without the church also grew. Additionally, apostasy among a few key members in the church over Joseph Smith's Nauvoo teachings set the stage for open conflict. The apostasy and persecution, the opposition came to a climax in June of 1844, when leading citizens of the county and possibly beyond conspired to murder Joseph Smith the prophet and his brother Hiram the patriarch in cold blood while they were being held for trial in Carthage jail.
So right as Joseph and Hiram were going to Carthage jail, Martha, the 3-year-old daughter got measles and a really bad cold. And so her mother, Mary, was staying up with her all night, trying to get her fever to come down. And she was reading the Bible, and she knew something horrible was going to happen. She had that sense. So it was all night until the next morning, June 28th, 1844, when there was a knock at the door early in the morning. And it was news that Hiram and Joseph had been killed. And Martha writes about how her mother leans against the bureau, the dresser, and she said the news flew like wildfire throughout the house. And soon everyone knew. She said the crying and agony that went through that house and the anguish and sorrow that were felt can be easier felt than described, but will never be forgotten by those who were called to pass through it. He was a loving and affectionate father, indulgent almost to a fault. When the bodies returned from Carthage to Nauvoo, Mary tried to maintain her composure for her children's sake. And yet there's a report that when she saw the body of her husband Hiram, that she trembled at every step and nearly fell, but reached her husband's body, kneeled down by him, clasped her arm around his head, turned his pale face upon her heaving bosom, and then a gushing, plaintive wail burst from her lips. "Oh, Hiram, Hiram, have they shot you, my dear Hiram? Are you dead? Oh, speak to me, my dear husband. I cannot think you are dead, my dear Hiram." She drew him closer to her bosom and kissed his pale lips, but put her hands on his brow and brushed back his hair. Her grief seemed to consume her, and she lost all power of utterance. Martha remembers that after her father's death, how sad and sorrowful my darling mother used to look. She scarcely ever smiled again. If we could get her to laugh, we thought we had accomplished quite a feat. I never saw her more than smile. Oh, how I loved my mother. I feared to displease her. I would rather burn my hand than vex my mother. I can see the sorrowful look my mother wore to this day in my mind's eye. God bless her memory.
It was June 29th, 1844. A public funeral was held for Joseph and Hiram. Their caskets were filled with sand and buried publicly, while the bodies of Joseph and Hiram were buried in the basement of the unfinished Nauvoo house to protect them. It was done in secret. Following the martyrdom, Emma and Mary both made critical decisions which would affect generations.
What's going to happen now is you have two sisters, Emma and Mary, and Mercy for that matter. They need to make decisions. Are they going to follow Brigham Young? Of course, Emma doesn't, and she'll stay, and what will flourish out of that will be the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Community of Christ where they're at today. But Mary and Mercy and Joseph Fielding will all make the decision to go west with Brigham Young.
She knew the order of the priesthood. She knew, I think through probably what Hiram was teaching her and what she was observing, that the apostles would lead the church. And when Hiram and Joseph were gone, Mary's allegiance went immediately to the 12. And when Brigham Young was designated to preside over the quorum, at least to lead the church out of Nauvoo to the west, she chose to go with the apostles. On the other side, Emma had a lot of complexity in Nauvoo, and a lot of things we don't know. And I've been a great champion and a great advocate that Emma Smith is one of the great women that ever lived. It was no small task to be the wife of Joseph Smith, the prophet. Almost every time he'd step out the door, she would probably have some anxiety would he ever step back in it again. So the circumstances were different. And frankly, Joseph and Hiram's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, was not well. There was some question as to whether or not it would be possible for her to make the trip west, and who was it that cared for her and took care of Lucy Mack Smith to her passing? It was Emma. So you got two great women. They had two different circumstances. They had complexities of things that were in the prophet's name and estate, and some of the things that were in the church, and all of that had to be sorted out. But the driving force, I think, with Mary Fielding, made it an easy decision for her, was I will go with the 12.
President Brigham Young and the main body of the saints left Nauvoo between February and August 1846, but Mary, Mercy, and Joseph would be among the last to leave Nauvoo. Indeed, they will be among those driven out by the mobs in the Battle of Nauvoo.
Finally, when the mob takes control of Nauvoo, they're allowed to come in under, and they have to leave and be out at the drop of a hat. So basically, with the clothes on their back and what little food that they could pull together, and they had little of that, Mercy and Mary and Joseph Fielding and their children, the three of them are pushed to the water's edge. They were fortunate enough not to be dunked in the Mississippi by some of the mob. They were able to skirt around them and get across to the Iowa side.
Martha Ann, the youngest, would later reminisce about those last moments in Nauvoo for her family. She said, "We left our home just as it was, our furniture, and the fruit trees hanging full of rosy-cheeked peaches. We bid goodbye to the loved home that reminded us of our beloved father everywhere we turned. We bid goodbye to our dear old feeble grandmother. I can never forget the bitter tears she shed when she bid us goodbye for the last time in this life. She knew it would be the last time she would see her son's family. We did not realize this so much at that time as we have since."
They cross the Mississippi into Iowa, and they are there on the banks of the Iowa side of the Mississippi when the miracle of the quails occurs, and they get to see that happen. They travel across Iowa with a great deal of difficulty, arriving in winter quarters.
There were 9 wagons in Mary's company as they crossed Iowa. It was a difficult journey. 6 of those wagons belonged directly to Mary. It is estimated that she was responsible for 18 people on that crossing. Mary's brother Joseph gave us some idea of the burden that she bore. He said Mary's men were slothful. She might cook for and serve them, and then go out and gather the cattle while they stood around the fire. It was after dark on the evening of October 21st, 1846, when Mary and her wagons pulled into Heber C. Kimball's camp at Winter Quarters, Nebraska.
We got to remember that in all of this, they're doing it together. They're praying for each other. They're supporting each other. They're keeping track of each other, writing letters to each other. The Fielding family was a powerful family.
Winter Quarters will be as hard on Mary and Mercy and Joseph as it is for everyone else who are suffering during this difficult winter with the lack of food. So this is the time now when Mary realizes, I have people I'm responsible for. And so they decide we have to make preparations so that we can join the saints and make this trek across to the Rocky Mountains. They decide they want to make some provisions, go to St. Joseph, Missouri, from Winter Quarters, that's going south, and going down and pick up more oxen for their wagons that they need to pull their belongings and their goods.
After careful bargaining, Mary was able to secure what she needed. It was while on their return trip north back to winter quarters that a telling moment occurred.
They bump up against a cattle drive going to St. Joseph. Mary doesn't want her oxen to get mixed up in the cattle drive, so that evening, she keeps the two oxen yoked together in their yoke so that they'll stay close to their camp. They need to feed to be able to move on for the next day. This is the story where the oxen become actually not lost, but stolen by the men in the cattle drive. Joseph F. Smith says, we were all looking, the grass was as high as our shoulders, we were wet. Joseph Fielding couldn't find him, I couldn't find him, none of us, we couldn't find our oxen, they were gone.
Joseph F. returned to camp to find his mother on her knees, praying. He gave this account. When she arose from her knees, I was standing nearby. The first expression I caught upon her precious face was a lovely smile, which, discouraged as I was, gave me renewed hope and an assurance I had not felt before. A few moments later, Uncle Joseph Fielding came to the camp, wet with the dews, faint, fatigued, and thoroughly disheartened. His first words were, "Well, Mary, the cattle are gone." Mother replied in a voice which fairly rang with cheerfulness, "Never mind, your breakfast has been waiting for hours, and now while you and Joseph are eating, I will just take a walk out and see if I can find the cattle." My uncle held up his hands in blank astonishment, as if the Missouri River had suddenly turned to run upstream. Neither of us could have been much more surprised. She bid the two men eat their breakfast and set out walking directly toward the river.
She meets the two men from the cattle drive, and they said, "You're looking for your oxen?" "Yes, we know." They are last seen in that direction. She doesn't even have eye contact with them. She stays straight on her journey and goes into the next ravine, and there in the tall grass are her two oxen. Well, as soon as she started that direction, the two cattle drivers went right to their cattle, and they got that underway, and they were across the hills.
But when it became her responsibility, as she had done, I think, in every instance that I see in her life, even going back to England, when it was her job, she did it. That's the difference. And she didn't wring her hands. She didn't have time in a lot of cases. So, the story of the oxen being lost, I mean, that's a classic. Brethren can't find the oxen. She gets down on her knees and walks to the oxen. So over and over and over again in her life, when circumstances surfaced that she wasn't sure, where did she go? On her knees. And she had the power of God with her sufficiently that she got promptings of the Spirit and knew what to do.
After a difficult struggle at winter quarters, the time came for the trek west to find a new home. Brigham Young left with the Vanguard Company in April 1847.
Mercy, apparently, by her account, goes early. She travels in Parley P. Pratt's company in 1847, arrives in the valley ahead of Mary. Mary follows in 1848, and she is assigned, she has, it's something like 9 or 10 wagons and up to 20 people traveling in her group. It's a large group. It's not just her children and her stepchildren and others, but it's household assistants and other people. It's a large group. She's assigned to the company of a captain by the name of Cornelius Lott.
Now, Cornelius Lott was quite a character, true. He was a Danite during the Missouri period. He was a good Latter-day Saint. He was stern. He was the head of the bodyguard, all the bodyguard of Joseph Smith. He was a prominent man, trusted by Joseph Smith. He was a man of action. He was a hard man. He knew the trail. He was an outdoorsman type. I mean, he was a good wagoner. He knew what this was about. In a way, Mary Fielding being assigned to Captain Lott's group of 10 was a godsend for her, because that challenge when he said, look, you and Joseph Fielding turn your wagons around, you're going to be a burden on us. And now Mary Fielding, she's not alone. Joseph Fielding's there, stood up and said, look, we'll not only make it to the Salt Lake Valley, but we'll beat you to it.
It was somewhere between the Platte and Sweetwater rivers that trouble beset Mary, who was already traveling thin. She had barely enough oxen to pull her wagons when one of them suddenly dropped in the yoke, stiffened up, and appeared to be dying. Captain Lott appeared and began to bluster about how he knew the widow would be a burden on the company. Without a word, Mary retrieved a bottle of consecrated oil and asked Joseph Fielding to anoint the beast. Joseph did so, then laid his hands on the glassy-eyed ox and blessed it. A hush came over the group as they watched and waited, and then a thrill as the ox, all of a sudden, gathered its haunches under it, stood up, and moved off and began to graze as if nothing had happened. They resumed the journey. When a short distance down the trail, another one went down. Similarly, this ox was blessed, and it too revived, stood up, and moved off. Those two animals, along with the others, would draw that family all the way to Salt Lake City. 69 years later, Joseph F. Smith would speak fondly of those animals. Worthy of note, on the morning of September 23rd, Mary's company awoke to find their oxen missing. The race to the valley in the forefront of the captain's mind, he moved the entire train off without her. As before, Mary knelt and asked the Almighty for assistance in the face of this impossible situation. Just then, a mountain thunderstorm struck, halting the captain's train and stampeding his oxen. Mary's son John appeared with their lost animals. They hitched up and were soon on their way down Immigration Canyon. Passing the captain and his party, Mary would arrive in the valley after dark on the evening of October 21st, 1848. Captain Cornelius P. Lott and company would arrive the following day.
I think the British heritage and her upbringing in England and her education, and the hand of the Lord has moved her along. And I think in the process of that, she had courage and almost a steel backbone, that when she saw something that needed to be done and she thought that she could do it, she did it. And Mary Fielding was not a woman who whined and turned to somebody else and said, woe was me, somebody ought to come and rescue me. I don't see any of that in her life.
When Mary arrived in the valley, she was given a lot at 2nd West and 2nd North in Salt Lake City, right in the downtown near Heber and Lake Kimball. Mary was grateful for the lot, but this was not what she wanted. One day after arriving in the valley, she saddled her horse and rode south into an area known today as Mill Creek. She was looking for a place to homestead, and she found it by the side of a crystal spring. That following year, Mary moved out into that area, built a small, comfortable adobe home, and carved a beautiful, productive farm out of the wilderness. Mary Fielding Smith asked for nothing, helped others, and was generous with the Almighty.
Another story is told by her son, Joseph F., that she took her best potatoes as tithing to the tithing office. And the man that was accepting, the tithing clerk that was accepting the offerings said, "Oh, Sister Smith, you don't need to pay your tithing. You've got too much going on. We need to be helping you." And she stood up firmly and looked him in the eyes and said, "You cannot deny me of the blessings of my tithing. I will pay my tithing." And she taught her children to always give their very best for their tithe.
Joseph F. Smith would later say, "Though she was a widow, you may turn to the records of the church from the beginning until the day of her death, and you will find that she never received a farthing from the church to support herself and her family. But she paid in thousands of dollars in wheat, potatoes, corn, vegetables, etc.
From 1850 to 1852, Mary lived on her homestead in Mill Creek. And in the late summer of 1852, she attended a public function in Salt Lake City. She had a really bad cold, and so she was really tired. And so on her way home, she stopped at Heber C. Kimball's home to rest, and she asked him for a priesthood blessing. This cold, she never recovered from this cold. 2 months later, she passed away from what we consider to be pneumonia. She died on September 21st, 1852, at the age of 51. She had lived a very full life, full of work and trials and blessings and testimonies and care for children and love and concern for the homeless and for the poor around her.
Mary fought to live. Her earnest desire was not to die, but to live and see to her family. But it was not meant to be. At the moment of her passing, Martha Ann ran from the house out into the wilderness and prayed that she too might die. Young Joseph F., only 14 years of age, turned deathly pale and fainted. Those around him had to work over him to keep him alive. The entire church mourned and grieved. At her funeral, President Heber C. Kimball declared, "If any person has lived the life of a saint, she has. If any person has acted the part of a mother, she has."
Her original headstone, actually, it's probably my favorite headstone in the Salt Lake City Cemetery, but it's just this small little headstone, and it says MS 1852. The family has since replaced kind of a larger headstone and created, not replaced it, but put right by it a larger headstone. But I see that small headstone as a testament to her faith and her perseverance and her lack of a need to be put up on a pedestal or to have a lot of attention thrown at her. She did what she needed to do, sometimes through very difficult things, and her faith was maintained.
Mary's life is just an absolute testimony of faith. She goes through tremendous hardships, and the amazing thing to me is how she holds her family together. These are very trying circumstances. Going across the plains as a single woman, just very difficult. Yet she keeps the family together and keeps the family faithful and in the church. And today all those descendants rightly praise her name for the role she played.
The great legacy of Mary Fielding is she lived 51 years in mortality. She never could have written a script of a life like hers. One who was mother of the 6th president of the church and grandmother of the 10th president of the church, Joseph Fielding Smith, the son of Joseph F. Smith. I just bear testimony to you that Mary Fielding Smith was one of those great noble spirits that Abraham saw and says, "These are my great ones."
Emmeline B. Wells writes about Mary and Mercy, and she talks about them as if they were the Mary and Martha of the modern day. She calls them female apostles of the church, even. Emmeline Wells described Mary Fielding Smith's trials as gold being purified 7 times, but that she came out a holy woman. She said one could almost see sorrow upon her countenance, although outwardly she was cheerful and always strenuously occupied with absorbing work. Strength of character was written in every lineament of her face, and she had a commanding figure, a sort of martial bearing, the carriage of a woman who could lead an army to battle. The Spartan mothers, so lauded in history, could not have been more heroic than this mother in Israel, whose name might with all propriety be emblazoned in letters of gold on the Smith Scroll of Fame. Her son Joseph F. Smith wrote, "My own mother, oh, she was good. She was true. She was indeed a saint, a royal daughter of God. To her I owe my very existence, as also my success in life, coupled with the favor and mercy of God."
In a certain way, what Joseph F. and Martha Ann, both of them remember, is almost a museum piece. She's a Mona Lisa on the wall of the Louvre. She's a beautiful statue, the Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica. And we awe and we wonder about it. It's just, these are beautiful pieces of art. But there's also another side of the story, the real human side of Mary Fielding. And I think sometimes maybe we haven't captured that. So primary sources, diaries, letters, all of them can help us bring Mary Fielding from off the wall of the Louvre, can bring her out of St. Peter's Basilica. And we discover that she was very human like all of us. And actually, in my mind, as a historian, I'm more endeared when I find out that they saw the same sun that I saw, that they see the same moon that I see, that they cry at weddings and funerals just as I cry at funerals and weddings. And so making her living, breathing Mary Fielding has only increased my admiration for.
The more I've learned about Mary Fielding Smith, the more I have realized what a powerful woman she was. I realized that she was real and she faced very difficult challenges that I didn't know about. The sickness that she endured, the trouble that she went to care for stepchildren and children and the needy and poor and homeless and the disabled. She was a powerful woman with a powerful testimony. And she knew that the Lord would provide for her. And I honor her for that. And I want to learn more about her, and I want to come to know her better.
Mary Fielding Smith, born July 21st, 1801, in Bedfordshire, England, and passed away September 21st, 1852, in Salt Lake City. She was only 51 years old. With all else that may be said of her, she chose the Lord Jesus Christ and his restored gospel. And notwithstanding unspeakable trials, so much difficulty, she followed the prophets. And her very presence on the trail and in the valley cheered the hearts of the saints. Why? Because as long as Mary was with them, so too was Hiram. Mary Fielding Smith. Her sacrifices and her faith should be remembered, along with those of every other pioneer in every other family. Those stories should be remembered and taught to the young, that they not forget the sacrifices that have been made for them and the heritage of faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
I would hope that every new member of the church at some time or another would brush up against the life of Mary Fielding Smith, because it would give them courage, it would give them strength on whatever they're facing and wherever they are in the world. And this day of time of preparation of the earth for the second coming. And we just hope and pray that the Lord will continue to watch over all of us, and that we'll use these examples in our lives to make our own lives better.